Thank you, Sheila. And I wanted to tell Daniel Dumbrio what an honor and privilege it is to have you on our Pivot to Peace panel, along with fellow Pivot to Peace co-founder Sheila Shao and Professor Ken Hammond. And you're right, Sheila. 2019 was a year of political awakening for me. Hong Kong was under attack. It started as a peaceful protest against an extradition treaty. The treaty proposed by Hong Kong Governor Carrie Lam would allow Hong Kong to extradite a confessed murderer to Taiwan to face murder charges of his pregnant girlfriend, a crime that happened while the couple was vacationing in Taiwan. The victim's parents had been petitioning for justice for their daughter and her unborn child, but somehow the rumor that this bill was a plot to extradite anyone into China caught on. It became a rallying cry for a demonstration against the Hong Kong government. In the end, the bill was withdrawn. The dead victim would not have justice. The confessed murderer walked out of jail and is today still a free man. The attempted extradition of a confessed murderer fell victim to a geopolitical game of big power, big money, and big politics. In these scenarios, the little people always lose. The demonstrations quickly devolved into a riot. For the next 5 months, Hong Kong became a mob scene, carried out by mainly young people, some as young as 11 years old. But this was not just any protest. Behind this inertia was a shadow power imbued with unlimited money, resources, and a plan. As we later learned, the US National Endowment for Democracy, also known as CIA, and the UK played a significant role in this demonstration. Their reason? To destabilize China. The protesters called themselves a leaderless movement. The so-called leaderless mob wreaked havoc upon Hong Kong with youthful impulse and rage. They threw Molotov cocktails at police officers and passerbys. They smashed into public buildings, struck at infrastructures, public transportation, and utilities. They committed random physical assaults against people who disagreed with them. And a 70-year-old man who was arguing with the protesters was killed by a brick thrown at his head. A construction worker was doused with gasoline and his body lit up by a match. He suffered 4-degree burns, spent almost a year in the hospital, and is permanently injured. Actress Celine Ma was taking pictures of the destructive acts of the mob and got clobbered by a group of young people who beat her up. She was rescued by an Australian reporter who was later harassed and doxxed by the protesters online. Thousands of protesters forced the airport to shut down all flights for several days, creating chaos and melee to travelers. A reporter from China was tied up in plastic wires and tortured for hours at the Hong Kong airport until he was rescued. A police officer had a finger bitten off by a protester. The Polytechnic University was trashed and seized from the school authorities and used as an arsenal manufacturing and storage facility. Thousands of Molotov cocktails were found on campus after all intruders were peacefully evacuated from the campus. The Hong Kong legislative chambers were broken into, where protesters started to rampage and damaged, trashed, and removed official documents from the chambers, much like what happened to the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, except the force and rage used by the Hong Kong protesters were more intense and more uncontrollable. Still, the police kept their restraint. The 2019 riot was called Black Terror by Hong Kong people after the black-clad protesters who felt they could do anything violent in Hong Kong with no holds barred. They destroyed 98% of the pay machines at the subway stations. Repairs were made every night when the rioters went home. Police officers could not keep up with the melee. The much respected and admired Hong Kong police force was branded as public enemy number 1. Hong Kong suffered human loss and millions of dollars in property damages. Businesses suffered. The economy was in shambles. The protesters threatened to self-destroy. That said, that would take Hong Kong with them. The destructions persisted even after the extradition bill was withdrawn. What caused these Hong Kong people to seek such self-destruction? Was their freedom and liberty really at stake under China's sovereignty? If so, how do you explain 93% of the Chinese people living in China rated the Chinese government favorably, according to a Harvard University poll? In 2019, Hong Kong ranked among the top 3 cities that enjoyed the most human rights and economic freedoms in the world, according to the Fraser's Human Rights Freedom Index. Hong Kong had enjoyed that ranking for the last 25 years, and 21 of those years were under Chinese sovereignty. Hong Kong enjoyed more human rights and freedom than Americans, which ranked number 15 on the same index. Under the one country, two system rule, China maintained sovereignty over Hong Kong, but allows Hong Kong to keep an autonomous governance with capitalist system as opposed to a socialist system in China. Hong Kong has a general public election system that their former British colonizers did not allow them to have, and a limited one only a few years before the turnover. But the Western world keeps portraying Hong Kong as being oppressed with no freedom. It wasn't too hard for some of the people in Hong Kong to buy into that kind of concept. For the longest time, as colonial subjects, Hong Kong people were oppressed by the British, which maintained a tight grip on Hong Kong's people through a British-dominated political, economic, and social structure. Hong Kong people were made to feel like an inferior people to the British. As people learned from the oppressors, many Hong Kong Chinese took a superior attitude to the Chinese in the mainland, who were poor compared to Hong Kong during the colonial days. Hong Kong people looked down on the Chinese in the mainland because of poverty and perceived backwardness. China was very poor in the 50s and the 70s. The Chinese were struggling with a new society without any resource or support from the outside world. But China is not the same anymore. Even though China is just across the border, many Hong Kong Chinese have never stepped foot into China. If they did, they would find out today China is no longer the China in the 50s or the 70s. It is a liberated society that regards people's life and society and welfare as its top priority. China successfully lifted 800 million people to middle-class status on par with Western standards, and in 2020 reached the goal of eliminating extreme poverty in China. It is the first country to adopt a carbon neutral pledge for 2060, first country to implement a digital monetary system that protects consumers. And in 2020, China owns its first version of the GPS, Beidou, a global navigation system. And let's not forget, China is the first country to end the pandemic and restart its economy way ahead of any country in the world. China offers exciting business and employment opportunities for Hong Kong's young people. Unfortunately, the protesters failed to see these opportunities. They rather buy into the Western ideals of freedom and democracy. That in practical terms is not always what it says it is. Throughout the riots, there were very little, if any at all, open discussion and intelligent discourse about the kind of society that the people wanted and how they feel a Western electoral system would work in Hong Kong. The demands made by the leaderless movement did not even consider people's welfare or livelihoods and their relationship to governance. They make demands for freedom and democracy without identifying what that means for the ordinary people in his or her everyday pursuit of a livelihood for peace and prosperity. They rely on slogans and empty words and gender emotions that turn into rage, that turn into violence. I think that was one of the biggest failings of this so-called movement for democracy. But Hong Kong was the perfect place for the United States and the Western countries to contain China. Hong Kong is a major seaport to the West. It has a rich reservoir of business and financial resources. Breaking it up from China would deal a huge blow to China politically and economically. But what is it but what is in it for the people of Hong Kong? These issues were never addressed in the riots. What matters is that there were powerful forces in the US and Western society that propagated the idea that Hong Kong has no freedom and that Hong Kong must depend on the West, the UK, the United States, to be free and to have democracy. Nuri Vitachi, author of The Other Side of Hong Kong, A Secret War in Hong Kong, documented funding from the CIA to support anti-government activities in Hong Kong. He said Hong Kong protesters get paid for protesting, and some received training in practical street protest strategy and media control from members of the professional revolution industry, which is US and West society funded since January 2013. He named US-funded foundations as being directly involved with Hong Kong's 2019 riots. Net's own website listed 170 million Hong Kong dollars has been sent to Hong Kong on mainland since 2014 to fund the cause of democracy. But these are not free money. The protesters were carrying out a job for these entities. Where we are today is that the 2019 riots failed. It doesn't mean that there are no little signs of unrest. After all, the US is considering a law to appropriate $300 million to support anti-China propaganda throughout the world. But for now, there are signs of peace in Hong Kong. China passed the National Security Act. Now that law would penalize people who commit terrorism, sedition, and secession against the Hong Kong government. This law directly addresses the power and influence behind the riots. It would not permit foreign intrusion and intervention to promote separatism in Hong Kong. We saw the city quiet down. Things were getting back to normal. Hong Kong is picking up the pieces and reinvigorating itself. We see life and prosperity returning. But for passing such a law that protected Hong Kong from foreign intrusion, the US sanctioned 11 of Hong Kong's leaders, including the governor, the chief of police, for, I quote, undermining Hong Kong's autonomy and restricting the freedom of expression or assembly of Hong Kong citizens. As a native of Hong Kong, I was greatly shaken by the violence that overtook Hong Kong and what I learned about these riots. And I'm more committed to peace than ever. We saw Hong Kong as slice of the upheavals when the US and foreign countries fund riots and promote disharmony in foreign lands. What would happen to the world if US and China go to full-scale war? The Nation's magazine recently stated, and I quote, "It is increasingly clear that Washington is pushing China hard, challenging its position big time, and often in a military fashion. And you don't want to know what sort of warfare this country's military leaders are now imagining there," unquote. Pivot to Peace has been imagining what kind of warfare our military leaders are thinking, and it is not pretty. We don't want to sound alarmist, but given the history of our country's never-ending wars, we know war is a possibility. But this time the target of our war is China, a formidable opponent with a strong military power, a nuclear potential country. And the price the world would pay for this war would be calamitous. We have a small window of space now to urge for rational thinking. Given all the tensions between the US and China, even a small token of a peaceful gesture from our political leaders to China will go a long way to avoid war. China does not want war. They have made that very clear. They also don't want to take US #1 super status in the world. They just wanted to take care of their own people. Why can't we do the same? We said we will do it, but we don't. Our continuing confrontation with China will lead us to war. Pivot to Peace urges our country's political leadership to work towards cooperation with China, not confrontation. Aim for peace and not war. And remember, China is not our enemy. Thank you so much for watching our webinar.